In this lesson, we will be exploring George Washington's presidency and the role that he played in launching our new federal government. Our essential question is, was George Washington's leadership indispensable in successfully launching the new federal government? In other words, could we have had the same success with anyone other than George Washington? In order to answer this, you would need to provide evidence as to what he did that was extraordinary, that others may not have done. So in 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected first president of the United States by the Electoral College. The way that the presidential election was first set up was the president would be the person who received the most votes, and vice president would be the person with the second most votes. So that made John Adams our first vice president. Here we can see George Washington being sworn in for his first presidency at the Federal Hall in New York. One of the first acts of Congress was to pass the Judiciary Act of 1789. In the Constitution, Article 3 lays out a basic structure for a federal court system, but the specifics were established in the Judiciary Act. So this established a judiciary, a system of courts, and it was determined that there would be 13 federal district courts, 3 circuit courts, and a 6-member Supreme Court. You're probably familiar with the Supreme Court, at least enough to know that today we have more than 6 members. That number is not determined by the Constitution and is subject to change at any time. It also established the Attorney General office to prosecute and defend on behalf of the federal government. And the Attorney General became a cabinet member position. Over here we see the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and our friend John Jay, who helped write the Federalist Papers. One of Washington's first acts as president was to establish a cabinet. This is something that is not in the Constitution, but George Washington realized that he was not an expert on everything that he needed to be an expert on to run the country. So he decided that it would be a good idea to have a group of close advisors who are experts in certain areas. So by establishing the cabinet, Washington set a precedent, an act or a statement that becomes an example or tradition to be followed. This is something that is not written down anywhere, but every single president since has had a cabinet because Washington did it first. So the role of the cabinet is to advise the president on various matters. The first cabinet was made up of 4 men. Thomas Jefferson was appointed Secretary of State. Alexander Hamilton was appointed Secretary of the Treasury. Secretary of War was Henry Knox, and the first Attorney General was Edmund Randolph. So as Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton was tasked with the role of establishing, basically, our economic system. You'll remember that the 1780s was marred with an economic crisis. So as he took on this role, Alexander Hamilton established an economic plan. This is important because George Washington entrusted young Alexander Hamilton to fix the nation's economy, a huge task, and many people were not happy with George Washington's choice. However, we will look at what Alexander Hamilton did and whether his plan was successful or not. So Alexander Hamilton created a 3-step plan. First of all, the nation needed to deal with the debt, they needed to create revenue, and they also needed to stabilize the economic system. So Alexander Hamilton's plan to deal with the debt was for the federal government to assume all states' debts. Then the national government would pay off all of these debts. This would give a boost to the national economy. However, not every state was happy with this, especially in the South. Most of the southern states had already paid off their debts. Um, so they thought it was unfair that they had already made the effort to pay off their war debts, and now many of the northern states would have those debts forgiven. So right off the bat, the South is going to be opposed to this. In order to get some of the Southern leaders on board, Alexander Hamilton gave up something in exchange for something he wanted, aka compromise that we've been talking about. So the compromise specifically to get this debt plan through was that the national capital would be placed in the South. It had been a big conversation. Where would the national capital be? Many people advocated for Philadelphia. New York was an option. And we decided to create a brand new district of Columbia and name it Washington. And that would be our national capital. Land was taken from the southern states of Virginia and Maryland to create this national capital. So how will we create revenue? Alexander Hamilton proposed a series of excise taxes. Excise taxes are taxes on the purchases of certain goods. Specifically, he placed a tax on whiskey, and this is going to be important in just a short little bit. He also proposed protective tariffs. We're going to talk about tariffs a lot in this course, so it's important to go ahead and understand what a tariff is. It is a tax on foreign imports. So, over here we can see in this image, right? British-made cloth is $4 a roll. American-made cloth is $4 a roll. In order to get people to buy the American-made cloth, you would add a 25% tariff, which adds $1 to the cost. So if you're going to the store and you see cloth for $5 versus cloth for $4, you're obviously going to choose the cheaper option. And the last part of his plan was to stabilize the system. In order to do this, Alexander Hamilton proposed creating a national bank. This would be a place to keep money and also to regulate the currency. There was a problem though. The Constitution says nothing about the creation of a national bank. This brings up a discussion of how do we interpret the Constitution. Hamilton argues that there are implied powers that in order to do what's best for the nation, certain actions can be taken even if they're not laid out. We'll talk more about that discussion in a second. Alexander Hamilton ended up winning this battle, and in 1791, the first Bank of the United States is created with a charter for 20 years. So, back to that discussion about the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, the belief that the government has any power that is not forbidden by the Constitution. So even if it doesn't explicitly say that the government can create a national bank, as long as it's something that doesn't violate the Constitution, the government has the power to do that. He believed this because of the elastic clause within the Constitution that says Congress shall have any power to make any law necessary and proper. So people who believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution believed if something was necessary to the good of the nation, then Congress had the power to make that law. The way that I remember the loose interpretation and its relation to the elastic clause. We see these rubber bands over here, which are made with elastic. If you stretch it far enough, all right, before it breaks, it is going to loosen up. All right, so the elastic clause allows Congress and the federal government to stretch their powers. The other side was a strict interpretation of the Constitution. The main proponent of this interpretation was Thomas Jefferson, who quickly became Alexander Hamilton's rival. This was the belief that the government is limited to powers clearly stated in the Constitution. So by following a strict interpretation of the Constitution, you would not be able to create a national bank. All right, it would only be the powers that were given in the Constitution. A strict interpretation would obviously limit the power of the federal government. An important thing to remember, this government was created in the 1700s. Our lifestyle, technology has changed the way that we lived, and it's very unlikely that our original Constitution would still be able to effectively govern us without the elastic clause, because we've been able to interpret the Constitution and make necessary changes in order to adapt with the times. The Whiskey Rebellion was our first rebellion under the new Constitution. This was in reaction to the excise tax placed on whiskey. Rural farmers in Pennsylvania hated that excise tax. For them, it was especially damaging to their way of making money because many of them grew grain. And because they lived on the western side of Pennsylvania, which is blocked off from the ocean by mountains, the only thing that they could do with their grain was to make whiskey. If they tried to move it to the coast, it would go bad before it got there. So whiskey was the livelihood in western Pennsylvania. They resisted the tax by attacking tax collectors in the same fashion as we saw during the American Revolution. Hamilton and Washington both viewed this as a chance to demonstrate the power of the national government, and it was necessary to put the rebellion down to show that lawlessness would not be tolerated. So, in order to quell these few farmers out in western Pennsylvania, 13,000 American troops were sent to put down the rebellion. Whenever they marched into this area, there were just a few people around. A couple of people are arrested, and most of the rest of the country viewed this as embarrassing, that 13,000 troops were sent out to put down this tiny little farmers' rebellion. However, it did demonstrate that the national government would use power in order to enforce the laws, right? As President of the United States, that is George Washington's role, to enforce the laws. And the excise taxes were the law of the land, whether the farmers in Pennsylvania agreed with it or not. So over the course of Washington's administration, the two-party system emerges. Political parties, or as they were called back then, factions, were unwanted by the authors of the Constitution. However, it was a natural occurrence. We see Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson have very different ideas of how to interpret the Constitution. So people naturally rallied together with people who also had those same beliefs. So our first two political parties in American history were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. These Federalists are not the same Federalists as we just talked about in the last section. All right. There were the Federalists who supported ratification of the Constitution, and then there was the Federalist political party. So let's look at some of the differences between these two. You have that chart in your notes. Make sure that you fill it in. The Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. John Adams would be our only Federalist president. They wanted a strong centralized government. They want a strong national government. They wanted an economy that was based on industry and trade, which is obviously favored by the North. They had a pro-British stance. They wanted Britain to be our number one trade partner. They wanted us to have good relations with Great Britain, despite the fact that we had just fought a war against them. They believed in a loose construction or interpretation of the Constitution, right? Alexander Hamilton believed in his elastic clause to stretch the powers, make the government stronger. And the society that tended to support the Federalist Party were the wealthy elite and people in the North. So that's the Federalist Party. The Democratic Republicans were led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, our third and fourth president of the United States. They favored states' rights. They wanted states to have more power. They wanted an agrarian economy based on farming, so they were favored by the South. They had a pro-French stance. They wanted to have closer ties to the French. They supported a strict construction or interpretation of the Constitution, which would limit the federal government's powers. And they were favored more commonly by the common people, the farmers, people in the South. So that's the Democratic Republicans. You may be wondering, where does Thomas Jefferson, no, you know where he falls. Where does George Washington stand, right? What political party was our first president part of? And he was officially neutral. George Washington was opposed to political parties. However, because of his close ties to Alexander Hamilton, he did have Federalist leanings. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the world. The French Revolution is happening. At first, the Americans support the revolution. They're following in our footsteps, but then things get a little crazy. Over in France, they're not following our method of revolution. People are getting their heads chopped off left and right. This leads to political divisiveness in the United States. Some people believe we should support France, and some people say, no, we don't need to get involved in that craziness. Which party is going to support France? The Democratic Republicans. Thomas Jefferson was one of the main proponents of the French Revolution. We had signed a treaty with France in 1778, forming an alliance for them to help us with our American Revolution, and then we would help them if they needed help in the future. So, do we have to help them? Many people would immediately say, yes, we signed a treaty. However, one thing that makes it more complicated is the king that we signed that treaty with has now been beheaded. So, do we still have to follow that alliance? Washington's action was to take a stance of neutrality. In addition to the French Revolution, Britain and France were also at war again, and each of them wanted us to side with them. We trade with both. We are trying to establish good relations with both. So you have the different political parties arguing who we should support in this war. George Washington decides that our nation is too weak to get involved. That if we tried to side with either side, that our new nation would be in trouble, that we would have the potential to collapse under that pressure. So Washington declares the United States neutral. We're not going to choose sides. We're going to focus on ourselves and try to get our new nation built. Citizen Edmond Genet was a French citizen sent to the U.S. to convince people to support France. This goes directly against Washington's call for neutrality. It stirs up tensions in Washington, and Citizen Edmond Genet is eventually told to go back to France, to get out of here. At the same time that we're having all these issues with France, Great Britain keeps attacking American ships that are trading with France. They are also impressing American sailors. Impressing means kidnapping them and forcing them to work in the British Navy. British soldiers in the Northwest Territory are encouraging Native Americans to attack American settlers and also providing the Native Americans with weapons. So things are not going good with the British either. American settlement in the new Western Territories had caused conflict between Native Americans and the settlers. The Battle of Fallen Timbers was the final battle in a series of battles between Americans and Native American groups in conflict over land. Literally, that's what we're always fighting about, land. The Battle of American Timbers was an American victory, and you can probably guess what we forced the Native American groups to do. The Treaty of Greenville ended this war between the Native Americans and American settlers, and Native American leaders were forced to accept the peace terms. Americans agreed to stop the military conquest of the Western lands and Native American groups, but forced Native Americans to give up land for white settlers to settle on. The treaty gave the U.S. most of present-day Ohio, and it opened up the Northwest Territory for even more settlement. We also signed a treaty with Great Britain. This was in order to settle relations and to prevent war between us and Great Britain. The treaty terms, Great Britain gave up their forts in the Northwest Territory, where they had been supplying the Native Americans with weapons, and the U.S. promises to repay our pre-war debts. So, if you remember, part of the Treaty of 1783, the end of the American Revolution, was that the British troops were supposed to leave the colonies, or now the United States. So really, this treaty accomplishes nothing except for something that was already supposed to happen. Yet we're promising that we will pay Great Britain pre-war debts. So a lot of people criticized Jay's treaty, said that it was weak and that it was embarrassing. However, it did avoid war between the United States and Great Britain for now. Pinckney's treaty was between Spain and the United States. The treaty terms was that the United States would have shipping rights on the Mississippi River. We see here, right, our western border is the Mississippi, and right here is Louisiana, which is owned by Spain. So who had rights over the river was not necessarily laid out. Also, the main port at New Orleans was very clearly in Spanish territory. So Pinckney's treaty is going to guarantee our shipping rights on the Mississippi and allow the U.S. access to New Orleans. It also established the northern border of Spanish Florida. That had all been disputed territory that we finally settled between us and the Spanish. So the effects of these treaties: more Americans are able to move west onto this land. We have victory over the Native Americans, removal of British forts, and access to New Orleans, which also encouraged more Americans to move west. We also are able to sell land to settlers, which helped raise money for the national government to pay off our debts. It also helped us avoid war with rival countries. So, after 2 terms as president, 8 years as president, Washington decides to leave office. There is nothing in the Constitution, originally, the original Constitution, that sets term limits. The president technically was able to serve as long as he wanted to. He could have served until he died, kind of like a king, as long as he was reelected by the people. Washington retired voluntarily after 2 terms, and this set another precedent. Every president after Washington served only 2 terms until we got to FDR in the 1930s. So, once again, a rule that is not written down anywhere, but that people follow because it's a tradition or a custom. One more precedent that Washington set. Washington did give a farewell address. It was majority of it was written by Alexander Hamilton, but he took this time to warn the nation against 2 things. He warned them to avoid political factions, to avoid political parties. He believed that they would be the downfall of America. However, during his term, right, we had already saw the 2-party system emerge, and something that we would not heed his advice on. He also encouraged Americans to avoid alliances with European nations. to trade with them, sure, to look out for our economic interests, but to avoid making promises that we would support them in conflict. Europe was in a constant state of war, and Washington believed that this could drag down our nation if we were constantly involved in European conflicts and politics.